In the late 80s, there were 3 important games, all released within a year of each other. These 3 games were all influenced by Wizardry, Ultima, and Dungeons & Dragons. These 3 games were inspired by the great early computer role-playing games, but the 3 titles in question were all released on dedicated video game consoles, 2 on the Nintendo Entertainment System and 1 on the Sega Master System. These titles were some of the first and arguably the most important console role-playing games. They would pave the way for console RPGs, of the J and W varieties, for decades. The world and character building, the gameplay systems, the tropes, all of it. These 3 games would be found in the DNA of every single game to come thereafter. The first of those 3 games is Enix's Dragon Quest, released on the Nintendo Family Computer in May of 1986. A game of adventure and discovery. You're the descendant of Erdrick and you're bound for glory. Your only real impetus being kill the Dragon Lord, with rescue the princess being a totally separate and optional request. Other than that, you are free to explore and travel just about anywhere on the giant overworld, with your biggest hurdle being the impressively powerful enemies who can flatten you in seconds. The second game is Square's Final Fantasy. Also released on Nintendo's Famicom, Final Fantasy first saw the light of day on December 18th, 1987, whereas Dragon Quest, a year and change earlier, had a lot of Wizardry influence. Final Fantasy had a lot of Dungeons & Dragons influence. Final Fantasy differed from Dragon Quest in having a team of 4 as opposed to just 1 warrior. You could choose your party members from a small pool of very different D&D classes, with the spell system even being similar to D&D. FF wasn't as open world as DQ, but there was a lot more character management, what with having a whole party of different classes. The third and final game of this list is Sega's very own Phantasy Star. This game in many ways was and is the black sheep of the 3. It was released on Sega's Mark III on December 20th, 1987. That's right, only 2 days after Square dropped Final Fantasy. With these 2 games releasing days apart, it's clear to see how Dragon Quest influenced both, but also how Wizardry, Ultima, and D&D influenced all 3. But Phantasy Star feels almost alien compared to Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. The game has that sword and sorcery flair, combat against fantastical mythical beasts, world building, exploration, character progression, dungeon crawling, but it also has unique factors that make it something impossibly different. While these 3 games are all very important in their own way, I want to spend some time talking about Sega's black sheep of early console RPGs. A game that helped solidify early genre tropes while at the same time subverting them. I'm Richard for RPG Fortress, and this is our voyage through the Algol star system to the Phantasy Star. Phantasy Star was released for the Sega Mark III in 1987. It was developed in-house by a small team of internal employees and a few hired guns. RPGs were becoming very popular in Japan due to Western ports of games like Ultima and Wizardry, along with imports of tabletop RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. After Enix released Dragon Quest for the NES, Japan was thrown into an RPG frenzy, and many companies sought to release their own sword and sorcery tales. Sega wanted Phantasy Star to compete with these new RPGs, especially the impressive Dragon Quest, which was slowly becoming the console standard for RPGs. The small development team wanted to give Phantasy Star its own unique flavor, so being inspired directly by Star Wars, the game was given a very unique sci-fi flavor. This blurring of genres was to forge the game's own identity while still being readily identifiable as a role-playing game. If you're an old school Sega fan, you'll see a lot of familiar names in the credits of Phantasy Star. When Sega was headhunting talent to start work on Phantasy Star, Kotaro Hayashida and Yuji Naka were the first 2 on board, as they were both keen to work on an RPG. Hayashida, who had previously worked on The Incredible Zillion, was to be Phantasy Star's executive planner and scenario writer, while Naka went on to become the game's lead programmer. Reiko Kodama, who had done design work for early Sega games like Alex Kidd in Miracle World and Quartet, was assigned as executive designer. She worked with a number of other designers including Naoto Oshima and Koki Satomori on the game's visuals. Kodama was responsible for the creation of Alice, the game's protagonist. This was a pretty big deal as not many games had female protagonists in 1987. We were still very much in the rescue the princess age of video games, so having Alice as a lead was huge. Also impressive for the time was the amount of women working on the game. We have the aforementioned Kodama doing the lion's share of the art, but we also have Miki Morimoto, who is one of the game's coordinators, and Chieko Aoki, who wrote most of the game's story. Once again, for 1987, this was a huge achievement. Also on the team was one of my all-time heroes, Yokohiko Uwabo, also known as Bo. This man is responsible for so many of Sega's early soundtracks that it's just obscene. This man must have been working non-stop 24/7 writing epic game music for Sega. This guy did Fantasy Zone, he did Space Harrier, he did Zillion, and he did Phantasy Star. He also went on to do Phantasy Star 2 for the Genesis, one of my top 10 favorite soundtracks ever. Phantasy Star's soundtrack, while not huge, is full of memorable and well-arranged tracks. From the majesty of the title screen's beauty to the intensity of Lassic's battle theme, the soundtrack for Phantasy Star is undeniably legendary. The story for Phantasy Star is one of freedom and revenge. We begin right in the middle of the action during Space Century 342 in the city of Caminite on Palma, one of the 3 planets in the Algol star system. A young man named Nero is face down and dying after a brutal beating from the king's underhanded police force. His sister Alice tries to comfort him, but with his dying breaths he begs her to gather a party and defeat the king. Algol's King Lassic was once a peaceful king, ruling the star system in benevolence under democratic rule. Yes, it actually says that in the manual. Lassic's transformation into a practitioner of evil began with adopting a new religion from another galaxy. He then levied outrageous taxes, once again from the manual, and shut down businesses on all 3 planets. Plus, the man had a police force of robot cops who brutalized the populace. What is this story? Being faced with a brutal theocratic monarchy and its corrupt police force, rebellion sprang to life all across the planets. One such rebel was a young man from Palma named Nero. While attempting to uncover the machinations of what caused Lassic to become corrupt, he is caught and brutally beaten by the robot cops. Because you know, even in fantastical stories set in magical worlds, cops are 1000% the enemy of the people. As Nero dies in the arms of his sister Alice, he begs her to take up his quest to uncover the truth and bring peace back to Algol. Alice swears that she will have revenge against Lassic and takes up Nero's sword to begin her quest. Alice quests all across the star system, gaining allies, obtaining powerful magics and technologies to help her on her quest for revenge. She recruits the muskcat fighter / healer Meow, the rifle-wielding hunter Odin, and the magic-casting wizard Lutz. She travels all across the lush green Palma, the sand-swept Motavia, and the frostbitten Dezolis. All of this leads up to her discovering Lassic's castle in the sky and our party's ascent to stop the Mad King and return peace to Algol. That and lowering taxes. The story of Phantasy Star is very cool. I mean, it's not told very well. The localization is a solid 6 out of 10, and who knows how accurate the manual is with all of its eccentricities, but at least the underlying idea is cool. There is no princess to save, and the protag is both a woman and on a revenge quest to avenge her brother. Pretty exciting stuff for 1987. The characters of Phantasy Star are interesting, but don't get a lot of development. In fact, they got more character development in the sequels than they do in this game, and that's something that Phantasy Star does well. The world building and long-term storytelling is awesome. The planets themselves are essentially characters. We see them change and develop as the games pass us by. I think that for its time, Phantasy Star did a great job telling its story. It was the beginning of a new era of console gaming, and despite being one of the first of its kind, this game immediately defied expectations. The gameplay of Phantasy Star is very, let's say, classic. Being as it was one of the first major console role-playing games, you can expect a lot of systems and tropes that are immediately recognizable. Systems and tropes that began here in these early games. Since we're all intimately familiar with this stuff, let's just have a quick refresher before getting to the weird stuff. Phantasy Star is a Japanese turn-based console role-playing game. Still with me? You've got all the good stuff that you'd expect. A huge overworld to explore, traveling from town to town, buying gear, NPCs to talk to for hints and world building, shops to buy and sell gear, battles with random monsters, dungeons full of foes to fight and gear to find, experience and leveling up, boss fights, lots of story segments to read, it's all here. What sets Phantasy Star aside gameplay-wise is a lot. Phantasy Star has some absolutely curious gameplay choices. I mean, it was the dawning of a new genre, all the kinks weren't quite worked out yet, so I can't really complain too much. Some of these gameplay systems can be completely ignored, so don't get too shook. One of the weirder gameplay systems in Phantasy Star is the talk system. When you enter battle, you can choose to attack the enemy, use magic, use items, run, and talk. The talk function will allow you to talk to some enemies to get hints or resolve battle peacefully. But this barely ever works. I have only ever seen it really work on native Motavians and native Dazolians. Most monsters are immune, and using the command on them will result in you losing a turn. You eventually learn the chat and tele spells, which work on some other types of monsters, but for the most part, just don't even bother. One of the cooler gameplay systems in Phantasy Star is traveling between 3 planets. In Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, you are limited to just one planet. They might as well be the same planet, in fact. That generic green leafy fantasy realm that 90% of fantasy takes place in. And believe me, I'm not knocking generic green leafy fantasy realm. I love generic green leafy fantasy realm, but Phantasy Star gives us high-tech green leafy fantasy realm, Sandswept Mountainous fantasy realm, and Snowbound Cave Maze fantasy realm. Wow, I am absolutely into this. Traveling Algol is an absolute joy, but I'd recommend bringing some paper for maps because things can get confusing. While traveling the overworlds and towns, you are in a top-down view just like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. But when you enter one of the game's many dungeons, the perspective changes to a beautiful first-person viewpoint, just like Wizardry and Ultima. These dungeons look absolutely incredible, especially for 1987. I like to dunk on Yuji Naka a lot, but truth be told, these graphics and transitions that he programmed are absolutely incredible. Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, and Phantasy Star were all influenced by Ultima and Wizardry, but only Phantasy Star retains the first-person view mode, at least for dungeons, that these games all had. This fact makes Phantasy Star feel a bit more romantic than Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy. Just a little bit of an homage to those old Ultima and Wizardry games. And man, not only do the dungeons look great, but so do the first-person battles. Those enemy sprites are big, beautiful, colorful, and well animated. The monsters in DQ and FF aren't animated. Hell, it took 2 additional console generations for them to get animated enemies. The first DQ with animated enemies was DQ7 on the PlayStation. The first Final Fantasy with animated enemies was FF7 on the PlayStation. Neither series had animated enemies during the 8-bit or 16-bit generations. By the time these games got animated enemies, Phantasy Star already had its final game. The series was over and done. How's that for perspective? Phantasy Star requires a lot of grinding. I mean, as soon as you leave the safe zone surrounding Kamenet, you need to grind. And be careful because even these initial enemies can absolutely body you. You can fight swarms and you can fight scorpions. Swarms might kill you, but scorpions will definitely kill you. Once you level up sufficiently, 2 or 3 levels, you can literally walk one screen over and be absolutely destroyed by the next group of monsters. Phantasy Star rewards slow, methodical exploration and punishes those who rush. Hitting a new level in Phantasy Star feels great because you have to work so hard for it. I both love and loathe this. I legit love to grind levels. If something is too strong for you, you take some time and you work at bettering yourself. You level up, your stats go up, you get stronger, and then you crush your obstacle. It's literally such an awesome feeling. It feels great. But needing to grind every single step of the way, it feels like work. I love how open world this game can be. It's not quite as open as Dragon Quest, but there is a lot of wandering that can be done. And when you open up space travel to Motavia and Dezolis, there's even more to see and do. And stumbling into an unbeatable enemy because you took a wrong turn makes sense. You accidentally went up the wrong mountainside and was killed by something too strong for you. Great, I love that. Learning from your mistakes, learning where to go. But it's like behind every single new tile of the map is a new monster that requires 2 or 3 more levels of strength to beat. Around every corner is something that is going to kill you, so you have to grind. And people hate grinding. I'm one of the few that loves to grind, and even I am turned off by how grind heavy Phantasy Star is. I suppose this is indicative of the time. You are meant to just explore. Play this game for hundreds of hours. You'll eventually find out what you want to know or where you need to go if you just persevere. But now it's 2023 and we don't have 900 hours for one game. Unless you're an FF16 player, I guess. Phantasy Star's gameplay is inherently flawed, but that was how it was in 1987. All flaws aside, this game still deserves mountains and mountains of praise, because what it did right, it did right. Phantasy Star has been re-released 10 million times, and you have a number of real easy ways to play it in the modern day. If I have to say one positive thing about Sega, it's that they are not afraid to port their classic games to absolutely anything that can run them. Going all the way back in time, the game was ported in 1994 to the Sega Mega Drive. This version was only released in Japan. Next, the game was released as part of the Phantasy Star collection on the Saturn. For a good long time, this was the collector's item for hardcore Phantasy Star fans. This collection hosted all 4 original games, but once again, it never saw the light of day outside of Japan. There was a PlayStation 2 game also called Phantasy Star Collection that may be a bit more viable. I mean, it was also only released in Japan, but it includes all the English versions of the games. All you need to do is navigate some Japanese menus to get there. This version also comes with a load of quality of life features like increased experience and walk speeds. You can get Phantasy Star in several modern day Sega Genesis and Mega Drive collections that are on the PS3, PS4, Xbox 360, Xbox One, Steam, etc. While not a Genesis or Mega Drive game, they include PS1 sometimes as a hidden game because it's nice to have all the Phantasy Star games all in one place. The arguably best place to play the original Phantasy Star is on the Switch. This advanced and updated version contains in-game weapon, item, and spell descriptions, taking the guesswork away from acquiring gear and engaging enemies in combat. This version decreases random battles and increases experience and gold for a smoother journey across the planets. You can choose whether to hear the soundtrack through an emulation of the PSG chipset or the enhanced FM chipset. There is also an incredibly helpful on-screen map to make those dungeons a lot more manageable. And there's even more to the game than this. If you have a Switch, you should definitely give this version a spin. Phantasy Star harbored a number of spin-offs, most notably Phantasy Stars 2, 3, and 4 for the Mega Drive/Genesis. These games were not just sequels, but were direct continuations of the story that began in PS1. There were a couple of interesting spin-offs on the Game Gear in the forms of Phantasy Star Gaiden and Phantasy Star Adventure. I never got around to playing either of those despite having English language fan patches. They both look like they're not incredibly important to the original game's canon. What is tied to canon are the Phantasy Star 2 text adventures, standalone minigames that expanded the plot and characters of Phantasy Star 2. In a truly bafflingly inane decision, they were originally released on the Sega channel. Thanks, Sega. And despite the fact that the original story famously ended in Phantasy Star 4, the series lives on as Phantasy Star Online. I never really got into these games, but I just love seeing that the series has managed to live on despite a tidy ending in Phantasy Star 4. Man, I tell you, I wish more game series would wrap it up sooner rather than later. Phantasy Star is one of those games that is legendary but still somehow underrated. When people talk about old school console RPGs, it's often Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy that get praised. And those two games are incredible, don't get me wrong. I just feel that Phantasy Star should get more praise than it does. My guess is that it's overshadowed due to the NES being a much more fondly remembered system than the Master System. Maybe if the game was also on the NES, it would have been just as fondly cherished as DQ or FF. From a technical perspective, the Master System was a hell of a console, but the NES was an absolute gaming juggernaut. Just a battering ram of incredible first and third party games. The Master System had some great first party titles, but really struggled with third party titles. Maybe Sega should have ported the game to the Genesis and much earlier in its lifetime. But even without the accolades that DQ and FF received, this game is still incredible and important. It was the only original RPG for the Master System. Every other RPG on the Master System was either a port or not actually an RPG. The console has a handful of those games that are RPG adjacent, but not actually RPGs. I actually just did a video about all of them. God save my soul. I highly suggest Phantasy Star to any and all fans of RPGs. The game has some rough spots like incredible difficulty spikes, required intense grinding, and dungeons that will leave you lost for weeks. But it also has a great story, great characters, great world building, an incredible mix of swords, sorcery, and sci-fi, and it's just a damn good old school RPG. Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy might overshadow Phantasy Star, but shadows will always fade in the light of a sun. That's it, another review in the bag, the big fat review bag full of reviews. Hey fam, seriously, go play Phantasy Star. Even if you don't complete it, just dabble in it. Boot it up for an hour and enjoy it for what it is. Have you ever played Phantasy Star? What are your thoughts on it? Let me know below. I know a few of you have some big time opinions on this game, and I'd love to hear them. If you want to support the channel, you can do one, all, or none of the following. Like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, join our Discord for hot RPG chat, check out our Patreon, send a super thanks, buy a shirt, pet a dog, feed your hamster, walk the fish, fill the cat's water dish, brush your marmoset, wash your rat, and unleash the mice. Thank you for watching. My name is Richard for RPG Fortress. See you next time, and don't forget to hug a cat. Goodbye.